Hi, it's a very great pleasure to introduce the latest in a series of talks given by lecturers who've been voted by you as the most inspirational teachers in the university. Today we've got a talk from Dr. Sorcha Macleod from the School of Law, where she's the director for the Centre of Human Rights. And today she's going to be talking on the subject of her sort of research specialism, which is human rights and business. Dr. Macleod.
Thank you very much. There's nothing more likely or more guaranteed to put the fear into a lecturer, and that's the idea of being told that you're inspirational, which on the one hand is a wonderful thing, but on the other hand then being invited to give a talk where you're expected to demonstrate your inspirational tendencies. Yeah, I've been losing sleep for the last few days. I can honestly say this is possibly the most terrifying thing I've ever done. But thank you all for coming here this afternoon, and thank you to those of you who are watching this wherever it ends up. I wanted to talk this afternoon about business and human rights because it's the area that I research, and there's quite a few of my current and former students in the audience here today, and they know that this is an area that I feel very passionately about, and it's an area that I've researched throughout my career as a master's student, as a PhD student, and ultimately as an academic. And so I wanted to just share a few thoughts with you this afternoon about business and human rights. Who made your trainers? And this picture is a picture of my trainers, my newest running shoes. I was going to bring them in and have them sitting on the lectern, but I ran the varsity 10K yesterday and they're still slightly sweaty. So I didn't think anybody would appreciate that. But yeah, they always manage to choose the most wonderful, bizarre colours for running shoes, and these are particularly vibrant silver, orange and bright blue pair. And it was really interesting because when I went to buy new running shoes, my other ones had worn out, and I went to buy them. I went to a local shop in Sheffield to buy them. And I didn't even think about who'd made my trainers. I just tried on half a dozen different pairs of trainers, and I tried them on the treadmill, and these were the ones that felt best. They were the ones that were most comfortable for me. And as somebody who researches business and human rights, I thought, actually, that's a bit bad. that's not really on. As it happens, these happen to be made in the United Kingdom, so that made me feel instantly better about myself, that they hadn't actually been made in a sweatshop in Southeast Asia. But what I wanted to talk about today are some of the issues around specifically the manufacture of products that we can buy on our local high street, in our local shops. And the whole issue of business and human rights brings together lots of different conflicting and intersecting ideas. And I'm not actually going to talk about law very much today, which for an international lawyer, international human rights lawyer, is a bit of a shock probably. I actually want to talk about what we can do as consumers and as individuals in terms of helping to ensure that the products that we buy are not the result of human rights violations. And so you can see from this little wordle is that the notion of business and human rights, and particularly when we're dealing with high street products, it brings together different issues about, yes, law, about labour rights, about international human rights law, about how states regulate businesses, both in their home state and abroad. And it particularly raises issues about people not working in safe environments, working perhaps in slave conditions, working in situations where they're not actually able to get toilet breaks, meal breaks, they're not allowed to belong to a trade union. They may even be children who are working in these factories. And we're probably all familiar with those sorts of situations. The sweatshops around the world have had a lot of publicity probably in the last 15, 20 years. And a lot of, particularly the sportswear manufacturers, have tried to address the issues with all sorts of fancy codes of conduct, all sorts of fancy reports, corporate social responsibility policies, etc. But the reality is that the products that we buy are very often likely to be the result of somebody else's hard labour, probably underpaid, probably in pretty nasty conditions. And from a legal perspective, this presents a real issue, because on the one hand, the obligation to protect human rights rests with states, rests with countries. That's their job. It's their job to make sure that human rights are respected. We've had human rights as a legal framework since after the Second World War. And it starts with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and we've got literally hundreds of international human rights instruments. But the problem is that international human rights law doesn't apply to anything other than states. So it's what we call a vertical relationship. The purpose of international human rights law is to stop states, countries, violating human rights and violating the human rights of individuals or groups of individuals. What international human rights law doesn't do is it doesn't apply to private actors, and that would include business actors. So you've got this gap. You've got this regulatory gap. But what we've been seeing in the last few years have been developments to try and close this gap. So whilst international human rights law still doesn't apply directly to business actors, what we've seen happening is the emergence of lots of different regulatory techniques to try and make business actors, if not legally accountable, certainly morally accountable for their activities in countries around the world. And so we've seen a whole variety of different initiatives. So you can see very recently things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is a framework to try and encourage business actors to respect human rights in all of their activities around the world, no matter which country they're operating in. You can see, as I've already mentioned, companies themselves have put in place human rights policies, corporate social responsibility policies, which are internal mechanisms where they say we can demonstrate that we comply with international human rights. You can also look to different industries. Different industries have tried to put in place codes of conduct as well. If any of you are in the market for jewellery, you can look to the Kimberley process, which is about ensuring that diamonds that are produced have not been, they're not conflict diamonds. They've not reached the market as a result of slave labour or as a result of something that's funding or oiling the conflict in the country where they were mined. There are all sorts of other industry-specific regulatory mechanisms which are trying to ensure that business actors behave responsibly, behave ethically, and ultimately respect human rights. But we've got a real problem. The problem is, and I think this is an 18th century quote, and it's one of my favourite quotes, that did you ever expect a corporation to have a conscience when it has no soul to be damned and no body to be kicked? And that's the problem. This is the problem. Companies are legal constructs. They're fictions. They don't actually, they exist in law, but they don't have a physical presence in our world. Yeah? They're not flesh and blood. They are legal persons. And the problem we have is that we can't make companies have a soul. We can't give them a body to be kicked, and that presents a problem. So what do we do with these companies? Well, we can try and regulate them. Fine, we can try and regulate them. And as I said, my area of research is all about looking at how we can actually make companies respect human rights. But what I wanted to talk about today was not so much about the company's obligation to respect human rights, but to talk about our obligation, our moral duty to ensure that the companies respect human rights. And that's where the Who Made Your Trainers comes into the equation. I've given a similar talk to school children as part of the Discovering Law project for kids who are interested in studying law, and they might want to come to Sheffield, and we have a whole programme, and I do a similar project with them, and I get them to look at their labels or the labels of their neighbour and say, where were your shoes made? Where was your jacket made? And they find it a fascinating concept because they've never really thought about it. Whether the audience here has thought about it anymore, I don't know. You can go and look at your labels later on. So the question is, who made your trainers? Because we are all consumers. Because I think the answer to these questions is I can anticipate what the answer to these questions are going to be. Do you or your family, your friends, do you buy trainers? Do you buy clothes? Do you buy mobile phones? Do you buy computers? Do you buy consumer goods? Do you buy food? Yes, of course you do. Where do you shop? Do you think about where you shop? Do you go to the cheapest place? Do you go and buy, I went onto the Primark website yesterday, and Primark has a dress for women on sale for £8. £8. We'll come back to that later. Do you know where the items that you've bought have been made? Do you know which country they've been made in? Do you know who made them in that country? Do you know anything about that country? Do you know anything about its human rights records, the state's respect for human rights? Do you know about the company who's manufacturing these products? Because one of the problems we've got is that so often the products that we buy are not made by the company on the high street. They're made by suppliers. They're made by companies down the supply chain. And there's a distance between what we buy on the high street and the actual manufacturing process, which of course that's a product of globalization. You know, we've seen this change in the way in which products are manufactured as a result of globalization. And so the question, the final question is: do you ever think about who actually makes the items that you're buying? Does it ever cross your mind? And what I really wanted to do today was not to talk about the law, not to talk about the regulation, but as I say, to get you thinking about the choices that we make as consumers, why we make them, how we make them. You might be familiar with the Rana Plaza tragedy that happened, and Dhaka in Bangladesh, when the factory collapsed and 1,129 workers were killed. Many more, hundreds were injured with very serious life-affecting injuries. Lots of them the bodies have never been recovered. People have disappeared. And the problem with Rana Plaza was that you've got a country, Bangladesh, something like 90% of its GDP comes from the textile industry. It's very much dependent as a country on the textile industry. And you're not talking big factories. You're talking very small factories with lots of workers, very poor, cramped conditions, very badly paid. I think it worked out that basically they're being paid on average something like £25 a month for the piecework that they do in these essentially sweatshops. And a lot of high street companies, Primark, Zara, Benetton, Matalan, there were lots of others. It was discovered that they were using these small factories in Rana Plaza to source their T-shirts, their £8 dresses. And there are real problems with this sort of business model. Obviously, you've got the problem of the companies in Western countries, so in Western Europe or across Europe in general, or in the United States and Canada, the rich industrialized West and North, using labour in countries in the global South, in Southeast Asia or in Africa, but particularly Southeast Asia when it comes to textile and clothing manufacturers. this business model is very problematic from a human rights perspective. There are very clear links to poverty simply because people are paid a tiny amount for the work that they do. There are links to urban migration, so people leaving the countryside, leaving agricultural land to work in the city. And there are also people who have been trafficked, who've been brought usually from the countryside to the city against their will, and they have no means of getting out of the situation, and it's described often as modern slavery. Now, a lot of these companies, and I just was reading, I was looking at Primark's corporate social responsibility policy, and they've been very clear. They actually stepped up to the plate and made sure that the families of the people who were killed in Rana Plaza were actually compensated for their loss. Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, Primark should have been checking beforehand, and all these other companies should have been looking beforehand at the factories where their products are being made. They should have been going in and looking at where the products are made. And we as customers and we as consumers should be asking the questions: where are these products being made, and who's making them, and what are they receiving in return for their labour? A slightly different example that I wanted to raise. So maybe you don't. Maybe you always buy. Maybe you make all your own clothes. Maybe you only shop in charity shops. Fine. But if you have a mobile phone or a laptop, then you're almost certainly going to have links to the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether you like it or not. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo, huge country in Central Africa. It's something like 2/3 of the size of Europe, the whole of Europe. And it has spent years and years and years in the midst of a civil war. And the part of the problem with the civil war is that it has given rise to lots of different armed militia. Some of the militia have developed along ethnic and tribal lines. But the driving force for the creation of the militia has been about control of the natural resources that are to be found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's extremely natural resource rich. So if you look at some of the figures, 30% of the world's diamonds are to be found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. 70% of coltan is located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And coltan is something that is in every single mobile phone. Gold is something that goes into new technology. So the chances are there's a 70% chance that the mobile phone that you have has coltan in it that was sourced in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can't get it. You can't escape from that. And the country has a real problem because the militias are fighting over control of the minerals, and consequently, the statistics for the DRC are quite horrific. You've got something like between 60 and 65% of the population is literate. So you've got huge problems with literacy, with lack of education, lack of access to education. You've got life expectancy, as I say, of 47.8 years on average. Now, compare that to the United Kingdom or to Western Europe, where the average life expectancy is into the 80s. So that's a big difference. So the mining in the DRC is a huge problem. It impacts on human rights in lots and lots of different ways. So from having child mine workers, for example, to people being conscripted into the militias against their will. So people have been forced to join the militias, or they're forced to work in the mines, particularly in the Eastern DRC. And the Eastern DRC is where the minerals are most likely to be found. And there's a UN group, a UN panel of experts on the DRC, which has described consistently that the exploitation of natural resources in the DRC are the engines of the conflict. They're driving the conflict. They're the reason that the conflict continues. And this is a problem, and this is something that we as consumers need to be aware of. And this is just a statistic that every time I see it, it horrifies me that approximately 40% of children aged between 10 and 14 in the DRC work in subsistence agriculture or in artisanal mining. And there are all sorts of issues associated with particularly mining. It's extremely unsafe. You saw from the picture on the last slide, we're not talking about high-tech mining. We're talking about, in this case, children literally going in, with small tools and their bare hands and digging the minerals out of the earth. And it's one of the most dangerous work environments that anyone, whether you're a child or an adult, it's one of the most dangerous work environments that you can actually work in. Now, of course, whenever we're talking about children and child labour, we've got to balance that a little bit because in many of these very poor countries in the global south, the children may well be supporting their family. It may well be essential that they go out and work. And it's really easy for us to stand here, or for me to stand here in the global north and say, well, we shouldn't have child labour. In the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, we sent kids up chimneys, kids were working in the textile factories, they weren't receiving an education. And one of the arguments from the global south is, well, actually, these kids they're helping to support their families, they're helping to feed their families, they may well be getting some education, or they're helping to support another member of the family who's in education. And it's not always black and white, it's not always very clear cut how we judge families who have children working in these sorts of environments. But what we can see in the DRC that is extremely problematic is not just that kids are working in these very dangerous labour environments, working environments, but they're also being recruited as child soldiers, and that is a particular problem in the DRC and has been for many years. So, where does that leave us? Where do you fit in terms of what we're talking about today? Well, as I said, what we're seeing here is we've seen this move towards bottom feeding, a rather charming phrase, in terms of the effects of globalization. What we've seen is that in North America and Western Europe in particular, but Europe in general, we've seen that it's become too expensive to manufacture products. So companies have looked to find other venues, other countries where they can do business, and they want to reduce their costs. Now, why are those costs reduced? Well, the costs are reduced because the labour is cheaper. Why is the labour cheaper? The labour is cheaper because people are paid less, because there's almost inevitably less attention paid to health and safety in the working environment. You may well have child labour being employed. You don't allow trade unions or trade associations, labour associations, to collectively bargain for better working conditions, better working environments, better wages for the employees. So yes, you will see that countries welcome, and states are to blame here as well. Countries welcome these investors. They welcome the companies that want to come and manufacture products in their country. But it's being done at the expense of the workforce, the labour force, hence the bottom feeding. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we've got limitations of international human rights law. Because international human rights law applies to states, it doesn't apply to companies. So companies, if you like, can get away with this because the responsibility to protect human rights is firmly and very squarely laid on the shoulders of states. The responsibility of business actors, the companies themselves, is not a legal responsibility. And as I said, it's much more of a moral responsibility. But in terms of being consumers, I think this is something that we can do. We can actually have an impact on this. And if you think back, some of us are old enough to remember the 70s and 80s when there was a policy of boycotting and disinvesting in companies that were involved in apartheid South Africa. And ultimately, those policies started to hit companies where it hurts, and that's their bottom line. Yeah. So whilst we can say, okay, maybe they don't have a soul to damn, they might not have a body to kick, but they have a bottom line that we can have an impact on as customers, as consumers. The University of Sheffield is a fair trade university, and that's part of that movement towards trying to ensure that we only buy products that have been fairly produced, where people get a fair wage, work in safe environments, safe conditions. The student union itself has boycotted Nestle, for example, since 2001 because of its policy of marketing baby milk, powdered baby milk, in the global south. So we as consumers, we can do something, but of course we're talking about institutions, we're talking in terms of the university or in terms of the student union, there's a lot of clout there. But we as individuals can actually make a difference. And it's what scholar Harold Coe talks about as norm internalisation through socialisation. And those of you who've been taught by me, you know that this is one of my favourite phrases. And Harold Coe says, okay, what we need to do is we need to get companies behaving in such a way as that they automatically respect human rights. That we're not holding a big stick over them in terms of law. We're not necessarily even holding a carrot out in terms of profit, but just that they do it because it's the right thing to do, and it becomes an automatic process. And he gives an example of seatbelts. Years ago, when I was a kid, not that long ago, but when I was a kid, you didn't have to wear a seatbelt when you got into the car. My parents always made me and my brother wear a seatbelt when we got into the car, and we hated it. But it wasn't illegal. There weren't legal requirements to have seatbelts fastened in the car. The law changed and said you have to wear a seatbelt in the car. But I guarantee that every one of us nowadays, when we get into a car, we don't get into a car and put on a seatbelt and think, oh, the law says I must wear a seatbelt, that's why I'm putting the seatbelt on. You do it because it becomes a habit. You do it because it's part of just what you do. It's automatic. It's a habit. And that's where we need to get to, not just with companies, in terms of companies automatically respecting human rights and making sure that human rights are part of their business ethos, part of the way in which they operate. We need to have this culture of norm internalisation for us as individuals as well. That we automatically start to think about, we start to ask the questions, who made our trainers? Who made our dress? Who made our mobile phone? That we start thinking about it in a different way, that we start thinking about labels. So norm internalisation through socialisation. So what I'm asking you to do is to think about how your shopping habits, your habits as a consumer, can actually influence what is going on in other countries in terms of the way in which human rights are protected, that you have power. You have an awful lot of power. And you might say, well, I'm only one person. But one person can be a powerful advocate, because you can then say to your friends, if your friend says, well, I've just gone off and I've just bought, 3 T-shirts for £10. You say, well, really? You did? Okay, so that's what, £3 something per T-shirt. Where was it made? Who made it? What guarantees do they have that they're working in a safe environment, that they're getting a fair wage, that they are being allowed meal breaks, toilet breaks, that they're not working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, they're not being locked up in sleeping dormitories. How do you actually do that? You talk to people. I want you to think about looking at labels as a matter of norm internalisation, that it becomes normal for you to look at labels, that it becomes an automatic process. And think twice about the products that you buy. So next time you buy something, have a look at the label and think about the people or the person behind that label. There's no point in seeking to try and make states or even the companies themselves responsible for human rights violations if we as individuals don't take personal responsibility for our own actions and try to live, if you like, a little more sustainably and to ask ourselves, who made my trainers? Thank you.